I'll ask anybody's question but yours. You're an idiot. And really a disloyal person.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Disloyal Idiots Podcast here on the Fans First Sports Network. Christian Guzman here, alongside Mike Ostrowski, as Steve and Andy take a bye week this week. We hope their performance after the bye week is a lot better than Syracuse's have been over the past decade or so. It's a worrying trend that I hoped didn't continue from the Dino era.
Oh boy, did it though.
It sure did. Mike, it's good to have you back on the Disloyal Idiots podcast. I wish it was under better circumstances after Syracuse took a brutal loss to Pitt. I am actually looking up the final score right now because I have chosen to forget what the final score was.
It was 41-13.
What Mike said, 41-13. As brutal as a loss that you could ever imagine to think of, especially after a bye week, especially after Syracuse had looked good, and it's good is a relative term, but like decent enough in its first two road games under Fran Brand, that you expected this game to be more of a contest than it was.
Yeah, this was sadly over before it ever started, which is crazy to think about because it was almost over before it started in the other sense, where Elijah Clark nearly had a pick on the very first play of the game, but unfortunately that one was dropped. Kyle McCord's was not, and then he threw four more. And, that's about that's my game summary for you.
It's hard to talk about this game without talking about Kyle McCord, because I feel like this is the only real story of the game, unfortunately, for Syracuse. It's that I feel like Syracuse was in this will sound probably horrific for some people to hear, but I feel like Syracuse was in a position to win this game against Pitt. Because I think if you take away the interceptions, some of those interceptions happened on long drives. And, Syracuse just didn't really punt that much either. They were going for it on fourth down pretty much all the time. Whether there was a microcosm of the game or just Syracuse's kicking struggles in general is another, question that's up for debate. But I feel like, overall in aspects of the game, if it wasn't for McCord's 5 interceptions, this could have been a game that was a lot closer than what the final score indicated.
And it was not all on Kyle McCord. And yes, it was absolutely his worst game in Syracuse. But there, as you said, there were moments where they could have gotten back into this. He had Aronde Gadsden at one point on what should have been a long passing touchdown. I believe it was early second quarter. It would have made it a 2-score game. There were several moments where, let's talk about the 5 interceptions for a moment, because there were some absolutely awful reads. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. There was also an SC top 10 interception, the second one, where that just says the kind of night it was for Syracuse, where literally nothing could go their way. There were some of the dumb penalties we thought we could maybe forget about, but I guess we're just stuck with that forever. There was the kicking struggles, as you said. Syracuse is now below 50% in field goals made this season, which, as impressive as their offense overall has been, that is a really rough thing to say this far into the season. And I do give some credit to Pitt. They are much more of a defensive-minded team than offensive, and it was absolutely their defense, not their offense, that won this game. And compared to some of the past tough defenses that Syracuse has faced this year, they just seem to have a much clearer game plan for getting to Kyle McCord. Even though they actually rushed him, they've actually blitzed him the least out of all opponents this year that Syracuse has faced, they did it much more strategically. And over the course of the night, you could tell the offensive line just seemed to get worse and worse. And it led to some very errant throws that pretty much ended any chance of a Syracuse comeback.
It's interesting to kind of play the distributing blame game here because, like you said, some of these mistakes that led to the interceptions weren't all on McCord. You had quite a few balls that were dropped by receivers, one of them tipped up, and then eventually intercepted by Pitt off a receiver's hands. There are multiple plays on both sides of the field where balls were tipped or dropped by Syracuse players. You mentioned the Cinco the Cinco mirror interception. You think back to Gadsden and I think the second quarter, who, while the ball was a little bit overthrown his head, probably for a player of his caliber, he probably should have grabbed that. It feels hard to try and figure out how does Syracuse adjust from this performance, because you don't expect McCord to do that all the time. So you got to figure out, like, okay, how much of that was on him? How much of that was also on other aspects of the game? And you mentioned one of them, the offensive line. And like you said, it wasn't all the blitzing that, Pitt did. And while Pitt did blitz, they did so not with frequency, but creativity. And this is where having Steve would be very helpful, but unfortunately we don't have him right now. But like you said, we get to the area of the team where, even though Fran said this was one of the most improved areas of the team, still is a glaring weakness of Syracuse, especially with the aspirations that Fran wants this team to have.
Absolutely. We don't have Steve. We do have the PFF rankings, which I am attempting to pull up now for the last game.
I shall join you on this endeavor.
I mean, because the eye test says it has to be the worst for a lot of the starting five.
Yeah, the for the starting five, actually, funnily enough, 3 graded above the Mendoza line. Actually, all 4 of the starting players graded above the Mendoza line in terms of pass blocking grades. I think a lot of people can imagine which of the 5 offensive starting linemen did not grade above the Mendoza line. And I think this is now somewhere where we've got to start talking about it a bit more, because I don't think it will shock too many Syracuse fans to hear that Demetrius Weatherspoon received a 46.3 pass blocking grade from PFF. And as the season has gone on, he has clearly looked like the weak link so far on this Syracuse offensive line, and especially where a lot of the pressure is starting to come from.
Which makes you start to question, is that spot possibly up for grabs in the next few games, or is there something they can do to try to salvage that left side of the line? Which it is weird to think about, because even in the past few years where Syracuse has not had the most consistent O-line, it was always the left side was the stronger side, and really where the run game was able to get some traction. That has not been the case this year, especially in the last few weeks. And going a bit further into the run game, we could get into it in a minute, where SU may be without some of their running back depth going into the next game against Virginia Tech, and how they can manage that. But for now, the point being, Weatherspoon was one of the guys that I was the highest on going into this season. And it's not to call him a disappointment or anything, because I do think he actually started the season fine. But whether the adjustment of starting to play against tougher competition has finally gotten to him, or whatever the case is, it has absolutely impacted Kyle McCord's decision making and how quick he's trying to get out the ball. I've noticed he didn't get bit by it nearly as much against NC State, but it seemed as though he has been eyeing down his primary target a lot more than at the beginning of the season. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, but some of these reads are like he's got his one guy he's throwing to, and that's it.
Well, I think it's also just a aspect of the Syracuse offense, just in general. What we've talked about and what you've seen a lot in Syracuse's offense is that it is based on the quick first read. McCord's getting the ball out incredibly quickly. Part of that is also due to the pressure that the offensive line is allowing. But McCord is, in general, looking to get the ball out very quickly out of his hands. But at the same time, that makes it pretty easy to read if you're a defense, because if McCord's going to have a quick trigger when he wants to pass, that ball is going straight to the first target he looks at without question in his primary read, without question. So if you can do what Pitt did, which is maybe bring a outside linebacker or safety blitz at random times, and they just so happen to be in the passing lane McCord is looking at, they can easily disrupt that pass very quickly and force him to improvise in a way that he might not be so comfortable with, to maybe not force a turnover on that play, but shake his confidence a bit and force turnovers on other plays.
And we saw right from the start that first pick six, it really did seem to rattle McCord's confidence throughout the night. You can look at the stats on paper. Yes, he finished with 300 passing yards again, but in the grand scope of things, he should not have been in the game as long as he was. And I'm sure that's another point we'll get to. But Pitt had the Orange offensive attack figured out right from the start, and making those first couple big plays really seemed to shut down any kind of momentum they had. There was the one deep drive where they almost scored. There was the ball that was just outside of Gadsden's reach. There was another drive that stalled out with an interception close to the end zone, may have been in the end zone. But outside of that, there was not a lot of offensive production because Pitt was able to really disrupt the flow that they've had. They really goes back to the very first week of the season where, yes, the Orange offense, McCord got maybe a little rattled against Ohio, but he settled down very fast. And in the second drive of the season, led a long touchdown drive. Most weeks went the same, where he capitalized early. That continues through the entire game. Don't capitalize early, like we saw at NC State, it takes a little while for him to get going. So that's something I think we're going to see a lot out of opposing defenses from now on, is being ultra aggressive early on and trying to rattle McCord, being a little riskier, especially on the outside when he throws a lot of those short intermediate passes to the outside compared to years past where Schrader and others worked much more over the middle.
And I think he also has the receiver talent as well to trust some of those outside throws. I mean, Jackson Meeks has been making a living off of all those plays, no matter where you put him on the field. You've got now you have Emmanuel Ross as an over the middle option, as the team's leading receiver in that Pitt game, quietly, because I don't think a lot of people paid attention to who the leading receiver for Syracuse was going to be for that game. You have Gadsden, who is being set out into the flat a lot as well on some of these, first and second down plays in order to gain some chip yardage. So it'll be interesting to see how Syracuse game plans for this Virginia Tech game. If because this is like you said, this will be okay, how can we get McCord's confidence up as quickly as possible? And is it going to be the same, death by 1,000 cuts drive like we saw against NC State? And what I think they were starting to try and do against Pitt to, let's develop the short and intermediate pass game. Let's methodically move down the field, our favorite typical 10 to 15 play drive that will get us into the red zone and hopefully score? Or does McCord figure that he might want to take some shots, especially with the receivers he has? Kind of like a la what we saw against Georgia Tech or something like that, where there were some more shot plays that were developed in Syracuse's early offensive schemes. That will be, I think, interesting to see how Syracuse tries and play against Virginia Tech.
Sorry, I would imagine from Syracuse's perspective, VT does have a pretty solid pass defense, but it's more in the secondary. They're not a great team they're not great at the pass rush, more so in those takeaways, in taking away the deep ball. So I think it does make more sense for them to, as you said, focus more on the short to intermediate game to start things off and see if you can open up those further passing lanes either. And also playing into that, this offense runs the RPO a lot, and that is something that I think they're going to need to take advantage of early when you may not have a healthy RB2. Obviously, Quinn Allen's still your bell cow, not so much a bell cow, but still your RB1. But now you're seeing Willis possibly not going to be at least 100% for this next game. How do they game plan around that, going back to only having one dependable RB? I know we threw it around in Slack earlier. I forget who said it, but do you consider moving somebody else to the backfield for just another option?
Yeah, for those who are not aware, we're recording this on Monday afternoon just due to some scheduling quirks based on the people we've got. And so we are actually recording this after Fran Brand's weekly press conference, where he confirmed one, Oronde Gadsden is good to go after he was seen in street clothes at the end of the game against Pitt. So Gadsden is good to go. And that Willis has a high ankle sprain. And he said he probably wouldn't play, but could if he can tough it out. As Fran said, like if he's anything like his dad, he'll play on Saturday. But it very much sounded like a doubtful prognosis from Fran. But we'll see how the week progresses for Willis. Because as Mike said, there's no more Will Nixon, just because he's out to a season-ending injury as well. Now you don't have Willis available, and so now you're running back in depth, and now we're getting into this area of the season for Syracuse is where your depth starts to get really, really tested. And fortunately for Syracuse, this year, depth hasn't been too much of a problem, mainly because Fran has done a good job and his staff has done a good job of building the team and the program in a way where you need to get really, really seriously hurt multiple times over and over and over again in order for depth to become an issue. Unfortunately, we're at that phase now, but this wouldn't have been much of an issue. This would have been more of an issue, I should say, earlier in the season, probably under some other Syracuse teams.
Absolutely. I am regardless of how well this season was going to go, wins or losses, I am very encouraged to see that injuries are not piling up across the board like they have the past 2 years. And a side note, I'm glad I haven't had to watch injuries pile up like I did the last 2 years.
And what's also very, very nice to see as well is that, I mean, when you take a look at the injuries that are being reported, I mean, yes, some of them, there are some people who are also playing through injury. You've got basically Fran saying like everyone's banged up. He said that Emmanuel Ross is actually playing through, some injuries right now, a toe and an Achilles injury, but he's saying, hey, you've got to tough it up right now. It's not that serious where you're going to have to miss some time. So you've got to tough it up and play through it. Marlo Wax returned last week a bit earlier than everyone expected. He's still not at 100%, but Fran said, he looked good enough to go. So the coaching staff threw him out there against Pitt, even though he wasn't, fully 100% and probably still won't be fully 100% against Virginia Tech, but that's what Syracuse needs him to be right now. So it goes back to, the start of what we kind of kicked off this injury conversation with, and it's the Syracuse way of building momentum. And as has been reported, as has been said, this is a Syracuse offense that basically runs, I would say, 2/3 at a time under RPO. So you need a running back who can also help develop under that RPO and help, give McCourt a better read under the RPO scenarios. And right now, the only one who has spent a significant time doing that in game conditions is LeQuint Allen. And so, how often do you trot Allen out there? Fran has not been afraid to take off Allen for long stretches of the game at times, just to give him some rest and put in Dixon and Willis when he's needed in order to spell Allen some time based on the amount that he's demanding from him. So it'll be interesting to see how Syracuse adjusts in that regard.
Yeah, and it would not surprise me if this is one of Allen's larger, if not largest, workloads of the season, just based on the conditions. I mean, he's had games where he's had 20 touches and has really been the only option out of the backfield, or games where he was counted more on in the passing game than, I mean, last year, if I recall correctly, he actually had the second most receptions on the team.
I don't recall. I don't remember.
Oh, sorry. It was up there.
Yeah.
I know he was one, not in a yardage, but in actual receptions. And he may have to be used in that situation a little bit more. He's sitting at 109 carries on the season so far. So 7 games, probably about 12, 13 carries a game. Where do you go if you're in a situation, if you're Syracuse, sorry, I'm rambling. If you're in a situation where Allen is not going to be able to carry the load as much as you would like him to this weekend, where he's maybe not going to be in the best condition to get 25 touches, be the only real running back on, and McCourt isn't able to use the RPO system as well as the team has used it so far. Do you think they look to adjust the playbook at all? Do they really start to open up the passing game a little more blatantly, see more 3 wide, 4 wide, where you do have much more depth in the receivers room at this point? You still have some people who really haven't gotten out on the scene much. Emmanuel Ross just had his first big game of the season, just as Ross Simmons, who we've still barely seen. He was one of, obviously, a later pickup, dealt with some injury, now seemingly back to or close to full strength. Does one of those guys start to be a bit more of an emphasis to get more options open instead of it just being Pena and Gadsden and Meeks?
Well, if Syracuse is going to help just in this offense in general, I think it also just comes back down to the offensive line. And I think that's just in general where Syracuse needs to put a lot of thought into this week. I don't remember if this was Steve. I think Steve might have said this in the Slack, where he said just mainly because of how much Syracuse runs the RPO right now, it looks like some of the offensive linemen at times are kind of out of sync about what read McCourt is making as well, and how to adjust their blocking scheme and style, where McCourt is making a read with the RPO. And so at times, what we also saw in this game against Pitt was a decent amount of offensive line rotation with 2 players in general. You had, of course, Weatherspoon getting rotated in and out a lot. Interesting enough, it wasn't Enrique Cruz he was getting rotated in and out with, which I think a lot of people would have expected. Enrique Cruz actually didn't get a snap in this game. It was David Wallaba who came in to take over essentially at left tackle at times for Weatherspoon. And then Josh Aloa was coming in for John Ray Reed at center. So you've got Syracuse now starting to try and fiddle and finagle with their offensive line personnel to see what's going to be the best option for not only we're going to Quinn Allen, but also McCord and what reads he makes.
It's maybe a little too early to play the Stone Cold Steve Austin music, but I am very happy to see Wolaba back on the field. I thought he was last year, before he went down very early in the season. I thought he looked like one of the better blockers on last year's O-line. And from being sidelined through the entire season, pretty much all of spring camp, he's had a long road to get back to this point. It would not surprise me if he and especially with the way that Weatherspoon played overall against Pitt, it would not surprise me if they are quick to turn to him again this weekend if there is that same problem either at the left tackle spot or really either of the tackle spots. I do think it'll be a bit more reserved in the sense that Fran is not going to. I don't think Fran is going to plug and play guys in the sense that he did with Pitt. It was a bad situation. I understand that they were well out of that game. They wanted to just try to see if something else could work, and ultimately Weatherspoon still ended up getting the majority of the snaps at left tackle. If a change happens this time, I think it's going to happen early, and they're going to stick with it. It's not going to be a back and forth kind of thing.
This goes to the other topic that you were alluding to at the beginning of this game, at the beginning of this podcast, which was the decision to keep Kyle McCord out there for the entire game. Because it felt like very quickly that, once McCord threw that fourth pick in the first half, that this had to be okay, he just doesn't have it this game. Let's not have him try to throw it out in this game. Let's keep him healthy. Let's just reset and get him ready for Virginia Tech. But he stayed out there the entire game, which I found interesting, and I know you found interesting as well.
Extremely. Well, I don't know if interesting is the right word. It's gave me Schrader at Virginia Tech last year flashbacks, as in why on earth is, and more so this time, why is the Golden Goose still in a lost game when you've got 5 games left in the season and that you have an offense that's designed around him that will probably fall apart, not just because of the talent difference, fall apart without him, not just because of the talent difference, but because of the way he operates compared to other quarterbacks on the roster. Syracuse was never coming back in this game in the second half. And even on the absolute 20-3 level miracle chance if they could, they were not going to do it with Kyle McCord. I understand you want your star to try to get some of his confidence back, to just have that one good drive or something goes right where he leaves the night feeling at least a little bit better about himself. But when you throw 4 interceptions in one half, you're still getting shut out. You got to know when to pull the plug. And this is probably the first decision of Fran's. Maybe not the first overall I disagree with a little bit, but the first I vehemently disagree with. I give him some credit back for he comes out after the game, takes responsibility for everything, apologizes to everyone, which is more than a lot of coaches would do. I'll say that much. But you and I both didn't like this when we were talking about it during the game. Maybe you've got some other reasoning for it now that we've had time to process it. I still don't.
This was very, from what I could tell, just based on how Fran talked about McCord during the press conference, his weekly press conference today, it very felt much like let's keep you out there just so that, again, you can maybe not only throw yourself out of it, but also, show that we still have trust in you. You're still our leader, and hey, yeah, the ball, it looks bad, but it's just that the ball's not bouncing your way. So keep out there and keep throwing it. So it had to be more of a trust thing with McCord, which is what Fran has basically done this entire season. He's put his trust in Kyle McCord. He's essentially put the entire offense in Kyle McCord's hands, and so one bad game is not going to shake or loosen that trust in him. I mean, he still ended up over 50% completions, just barely, over 300 yards, just barely. But at the same time, obviously, you can't ignore the 5 interceptions. Yeah, that's obviously something you don't ignore. But it feels like, hey, it was a much better second half from McCord than it was in the first half, especially as Pitt started to let off the gas a little bit.
Yeah, and to that point, I feel like there was a second point where you should have pulled him. It was in the third quarter. Syracuse finally gets that touchdown drive that ends with a McCord sneak. That's your point. You scored. What else are you going to get out of it? You were still down 31-6 at that point, about 20 minutes left in the game. Pitt on the very next drive goes it not on the next drive, excuse me, that they do score in the fourth quarter to pad their lead even more. There were still chances in the second half to say, okay, we've made our point with Kyle. You got your one good drive. We still have plenty of confidence in you the rest of the way. And maybe it's an apples to oranges, but we're talking about Kyle McCord. We're not talking about like Daniel Jones and New York Giants, where conservatively half the fan base has wanted him benched for weeks. Not one person in Syracuse wants Kyle McCord benched long term. Not one person in Syracuse should lose confidence in Kyle McCord even after a game that bad. We've seen the good. We've seen how good he can be and how good he has been compared to just about everybody who's been behind center for Syracuse since you and I have been born. So again, maybe I'm putting a little too much emphasis on this. It's still a decision I'm scratching my head over. And hopefully what's going to happen is McCord is going to appreciate that trust from Fran and he's going to go out and have the complete opposite performance this weekend. And then I could just shut up about it and we'll all be happy.
You know who you can put your complete trust in, though? Our friends
I'm wearing one of their shirts. So yeah.
Indeed. Our friends at homefieldapparel.com, a sponsor of the great Disloyal Idiots podcast here on the Fans First Sports Network. Homefield Apparel is where you can get some of your best throwback and the comfiest throwback apparel needs for any school, whether it be Syracuse or whatever it might be, especially if your school happens to win a championship over maybe a school like Indiana. I'm not sure. Hi, everyone at Homefield. Who probably had a very, very good time with College Game Day as well, coming to Indiana as well. That must have been very, very fun for everyone at Homefield Apparel. Why don't you go over to homefieldapparel.com, pick up one of their swaggiest clothing options that you want from Syracuse or any other school of your choosing, and you can use the code NUNES24, that's NUNES24, and you can get 15% off your very first purchase at homefieldapparel.com.
You know, I wish you didn't bring up game day because one, Kyle Schwarber was there instead of in the World Series like your guys. So,
well, to be fair, half of our players aren't also at the World Series. Also, I'm talking about my beloved Yankees. We're hoping they show up tonight.
You're hoping they show up tonight. I just want chaos.
This is fair, as is the rest of the baseball world.
But since Syracuse is not a baseball school,
so sad. Still really needs to change at some point. We touched on this at the beginning of this podcast, and I think it bears a good look into it as well, because again, I think a lot of this loss falls on McCord's shoulders. You know, come back from 5 interceptions, especially when 2 of them were pick sixes. The defense on this side did not
Sorry, my
do
fingers weren't showing, but 3 of them were pick sixes.
3. Shows you how much I've shoved this game out of my memory. The defense, to be fair, did itself a pretty good job. Now, Desmond Reed was definitely not on 100%. I think he was injured at some point during the first half and was not on 100%. And Eli Holstein had some good throws, but definitely didn't light the Syracuse defense on fire. This was a Syracuse defense that, if it played the way it did, I think the majority of the time Syracuse wins that game.
Which is a very good point to make, because much more of the criticism, well, there's special teams, but that's a whole other story. But most of the criticism of Syracuse has not been on their offense. It's been on the defensive side of the ball, how maybe they play a little too conservatively with this 4-2-5. Still seems more like a 3.5 3-3-5, where if they really rush 3 most of the time, are content to drop 8 men back in zone coverage and really let teams take those short yardage plays. This time, they did a pretty solid job at holding Pitt. Now, there's only 4 teams in the ACC that are holding opponents to below 4 yards per pass attempt. Syracuse, in this pass attempt game against Pitt, was hovering right around 5. So they are starting to even out as that middle of the pack kind of defense, which is really all you need them to be when you are this and you've invested this much into the weapons in the offense. It's still a system that had a lot of turnover. You had several position changes. You still have Justin Barron looking like he's staying out there at linebacker, which is something we've been hoping for, even with Marlo Wax coming back now. That believe that, at least in this system, that is a net positive move. Devin Grant, formerly a safety, moving to the outside. He had we talked about this during the game. There's maybe one play where he let his guy go a little too early, but I think he had a solid game. You're same with Deuce Chestnut. You're seeing these couple position changes starting to come together, and those are the positions especially that are going to need to do a lot of the heavy lifting through the stretch, because the D-line is, unfortunately, that is the one position group that is really shot with injuries, and there's nothing Syracuse can really do to alleviate that. They're two, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the tackles that are both out for the season. Yeah. Not a great place to be, but it's also a place where having that stronger focus on the secondary as opposed to the front, as opposed to the pass rush, could be more advantageous as we go into the next few games.
And when you take a look, defensive wise as well, personnel wise, Frank didn't 100% confirm it, but if I had to be a betting man, I would guess that Justin Barron is going to stay at linebacker with Marlo Wax, and that Devin Grant is going to stay at Barron's star / nickelback / safety spot that Syracuse has in the 4-2-5 / 3-3-5, whatever you want to call this Syracuse defense right now. And again, when you look at the stats, total offense wise, Syracuse had 327 yards of total offense, and Pitt only had 217 yards of total offense. What also didn't help was 8 Syracuse penalties for 70 yards, but a lot of those were on the offensive line, which we've already discussed that with great length. Like when you look at it, that was just under 5 yards a play that Pitt was averaging. Like Mike said, that's in general. If Syracuse is going to put up that kind of defensive game, that's a Syracuse defensive effort that you'll take a lot of times.
And it's an effort that I'm glad we've gotten to the point where, that is a good Syracuse, a reasonable expectation for the Syracuse defense that they can get done, and that it's no longer like the last couple of years where it's been much more of a defensive focused team, and the offense has just been trying to scrape out yards. This is a much bigger picture thing I want to get out of the way real quick. Defensive-minded teams just don't work anymore, whether it's at the college level or at the NFL. We could do a case study on Iowa, but there are others. You're not interested in that. I see. We'll get our former.
No one's interested in a defensive case study of Iowa. No one.
I'm trying to say we'll get our former basketball expert Dom on that, as he is out in the great city of Des Moines. But keeping it with Syracuse, it's so much nicer to have more of the focus be on the offense and just letting the defense force big plays. It's like you take the easy underneath. We want to let teams try to give you the death by 1,000 cut treatment. Give them time to make a mistake. Give them time to be too aggressive. Take that deep shot in the double coverage or whatever the situation might be. It's been a much bigger for the criticisms, and some are legit criticisms of what Elijah Robinson has put forward so far. I think overall, the defense is still a net improvement, a net positive.
Oh, definitely. I don't think anyone is going to disagree to say that this defense is a downgrade from last year.
Well, see, you don't read the game threads. I do.
Yes, this is a great point. Because my mental health it needs to be saved in some way. And that is one way to do it. It is not go into the game threads. What I will do is go into what does Syracuse do from here? Kind of already touched on it with Virginia Tech. Defensively wise, it'll be very, very interesting to see again, because we've seen Syracuse at times struggle defensive wise with dual threat quarterbacks. And Kyron Jones is a quarterback who can dual threat very, very well.
Dual threat very well indeed. Sorry, I was trying to pull up the appropriate stats, but yeah. Before Cam Ward decided to do Cam Ward things, I thought Drones was going to be the best quarterback in the ACC this year. I had a lot of faith in Virginia Tech, being biased because of the Penn State side of me, led by a coach who's always built great defenses, and it would just take some time for the offense to figure itself out. And sometimes it has. It's weird. Virginia Tech is one of the more streakier offenses in the conference right now. When they get going, they will put together, it seems like 4 or 5 consecutive drives where nothing goes wrong. But when they're cold, they are as ice cold as the Phillies bats were in the division series. Good old 186 average.
Yeah. This, I think, is going to be interesting because I think we now know more than ever that this is going to be a Syracuse team that lives and dies by McCord. If it wasn't apparent before, it's blatantly apparent now, because as we now have gone over multiple times, Syracuse wins this game if Kyle McCord doesn't throw 5 interceptions and 3 pick sixes. Probably, I think. I think if
you would hope.
You would hope so. But again, we're not in the business of ifs, fans, or buts. We're in the business of what we saw, and what we saw is that unfortunately, Pitt basically took advantage of a scheme that they saw that they could disrupt Kyle McCord based on disguising blitzes very well, bringing pressure at the appropriate time, and capitalizing on those right moments. I don't think Virginia Tech's defense is quite capable in the same way to put a team effort like Pittsburgh did into thwarting McCord. So, can Syracuse do enough to get McCord's engines running so that he can once again lead the Syracuse team?
That is the question. And you could find out on the glorious football network known as the CW.
Which is why I'm glad I don't have to try and find a way to watch this game. Glad to be back home. This will be good for Syracuse as well. Because let's remember, this is going to be the first time Syracuse is going to be home. It's also going to be homecoming week as well for Syracuse. So you'll have more alumni in attendance. For a lot of people, this will be the first time to see Fran Brown's team in the flesh for the first time. Again, home after a long 4-week stretch, 3 games in a bye, no games in October. Syracuse will be very, very glad to return to the friendly confines of the JMA Wireless Dome.
Appropriate Wi-Fi still pending, I assume.
Yep.
It'll also be very, very small note. It'll also be the last full student section game.
Yes, this is going to be very, very important as well. There's going to be a limited student section apparently for the Miami game, but that is only going to be limited to the lower bowl of the student section. They are not selling upper bowl student section tickets for the Miami game. So the full student section, the last time it'll be a full student section, is going to be for this game against Virginia Tech.
So, Autos, do your job, guys.
They're going to need to, because, again, it feels like this, again, a team where it rides on momentum a lot.
Definitely. I mean, that's honestly not that much different than the past couple of years where we've had a 6-game win streak and a 4-game win streak and 2 5-game losing streaks.
Yeah.
Now, this year we haven't had those long stretches, but you worry that, okay, the first loss was a very narrow, it was quite literally, if Io Manor was double covered, Syracuse probably sits at 6-1. Maybe they're at 7-0. But again, we don't do the ifs, ands, or buts. This is the first time Syracuse is coming off a truly deflating loss. And unlike their first loss, which was a very close game where they had a rough start, they rallied, they ultimately fell short, they don't get an FCS opponent this week. They get one that is also fighting for a bowl game, fighting to try to move up the ranks in the ACC to get a better bowl game at the end of the year. Not exactly competing for the conference, but still one of the better teams Virginia Tech has had in quite some time.
It's so, like you said, Syracuse needs to come out strong. I think they've got to get ahead quickly. A lot of Syracuse players have said that they've just got to get out quickly and make sure that they start incredibly quickly as well, because they are that much more comfortable when they play ahead. As long as they can do that, I think they can find some success against Virginia Tech. It'll be interesting to see how that all rolls out. Again, it'll be a nooner on the CW. A wonderful time to be had for all on the CW. We will be very, very interested to see how that works out. I will be very interested to see how the fan reaction is to an at-home viewing experience of a CW football game for Syracuse football.
It will be interesting. I will have to put it on. I guess I'll do the quad box. I mean, you got to have the Penn State Ohio State on too.
That is a slightly more interesting game than Syracuse Virginia Tech right now.
Perspective and all. Mm-hmm. I'm not telling people don't watch Syracuse, but
are you interested?
I really wish they got the 3:30 slot.
Are you interested in Syracuse versus Clarion or Syracuse versus Slippery Rock?
The Rock.
Indeed, the Rock.
I mean, yes. The Syracuse Orange versus the Slippery Rock, the Rock, will be a matchup of all time.
if we're talking about these schools, that can only mean one thing. It's finally basketball season, and for the people who have been longing for basketball content, you can finally get it. Especially after we had Sam on last week, we can continue some more basketball talk as exhibition season has finally started. We'll spend the last couple of minutes on the podcast talking about good old basketball season, and it has been good old basketball season because it feels like, especially after this first exhibition game, there is a bit of renewed optimism about what Syracuse could potentially bring to the table this season.
So, for the record, I wasn't able to catch a ton of this game because
Oh yeah, me neither. But still, I
because
saw
of,
enough social media action to.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Mhm.
But first of all, Eddie Lampkin is one big dude, and I am happy to have that one big dude as what early indications seem to say would be the go-to guy in this Orange offense.
You still have Chris Bell and JJ Starling. It was Bell who led the team in points with 17. Starling had 16 right behind him as the men who led the way for Syracuse in their exhibition thumping of Clarion, as you would expect. And this is also a refreshing thing because it felt like, Syracuse hasn't had too many comfortable exhibition wins in past years. And just comfortable wins over teams you should beat, period, type games. I felt like, some of these, gimme games that Syracuse was getting, and even some of the exhibition games Syracuse was getting, there were plenty of problems and plenty of times where just Syracuse, it really took a while for them to get their foot into the game. But this was like a good, alrighty, let's settle things down, let's play our game, and let's beat this team that we're supposed to beat by a lot. And that's what Syracuse did.
And they did that by trotting out a couple configurations I didn't expect to see. And yes, I know it's preseason. I know this time you want to experiment. But that starting five was not what I thought it was going to be. Some of the combinations we saw with Donnie Freeman out there, he got a few minutes at the five. So there's a couple avenues we could go in the final 7 or so minutes.
Yeah, when you look at the starting lineup, it was JJ Starling, Jaquan Carlos, Lucas Taylor, Peter Mastrovich. Well, eventually learn how to say Peter's name eventually, and Eddie Lampkin. But other than Jaquan Carlos, who played 31 minutes, the next three players who played the most minutes all came off the bench. It was Choppa Moore at 21 minutes, and then Chris Bell and Donnie Freeman each played 20 minutes. So for the first time in quite some time, there I think is a lot more comfortability with the roster flexibility that Red has.
Which is something that is very encouraging to see. Last year was a step towards not necessarily having 5 guys run out for 30 odd minutes and dipping into the bench a little bit more. Injuries kind of derailed that, especially in the second half of the season. But now the depth looks even better. And again, we know first impressions, maybe it's a little too much to say that from an exhibition game, but Pat Petar, again, we will make sure we learn your name correctly. Looks like a great late pickup. Autry didn't get him until over the summer. We thought, maybe he's more of a 2025, a project guy who would just come in and learn the system this year. After those first impressions, he may very well be the number 2 center on the depth chart right now.
The important thing is, though, with Mastorovich is that we need to talk about pizza decisions with him, which is, of course, how we should end this podcast fittingly.
Is there any other way?
No. I made sure that Sam asked Peter about, his pizza preferences, and he responded with saying he has tried Mario and Salvo's. He likes it, but he prefers the European pizzas better, which means that this trip to Barclays Center in November and December are going to be very, very important cultural trips for him.
Extremely. Although I'm glad he's on the Mario and Savos train. That was always my favorite.
I mean, it's a reason why it's an option for the Syracuse players now after the games. Of course, we shall need to get Peter in touch with Marek Dolishai in order for them to compare pizza notes.
We'll also have to pray he doesn't lose a tooth in the process against a certain Washington, D.C. based team.
Hopefully that doesn't happen for his sake. I mean, especially, it was really funny listening to Marek after that, just complaining because he couldn't have pizza after that tooth incident with Georgetown. And I think it was for like 2 weeks, and he was not happy about that situation.
That is an extremely appropriate reaction.
This is indeed true, because I remember when when I first got braces as a kid, the food situation was not fun.
No.
No,
don't make me relive that either.
No, I don't want to relive that either. Kidding me?
No.
So I think that was one good place to end off. I think there is one more place I'd like to end off as well, because a lot of people were really, really happy what they saw, at least online, from what they saw from Jaquan Carlos. And that's mainly because what we've heard about him is true, and that Carlos is, in fact, a true point guard, which Syracuse hasn't had in forever on its team. A good
probably since I've been following Syracuse,
and
quote unquote professionally following Syracuse basketball.
This goes back to before our times. We'll have to consult Kevin and Steve on when the last time Syracuse had a true point guard, because the closest I think you can get to that is Ennis, and Ennis was still a score first point guard.
Yeah.
So it also just goes to show you kind of how basketball has evolved these days, especially once Steph Curry started making waves in the NBA. It became cool and much more preferable to be a score first point guard like Curry was. And so that only works on certain teams, and especially in college, especially what we've seen from Syracuse. I think Syracuse has been missing something like that, a facilitator at point guard, in order to really, really drive forward how the program essentially wants to play, and especially under Red, how this program wants to play as a fast-moving program and a fast-moving team that plays with tempo. And now you saw in that exhibition game more off-ball movement, more passes in the half-court setting. No more standing around and waiting for something magically to happen. That's something that we've seen from Syracuse that we've been looking for quite some time.
Yes, amen to the lack of iso ball.
And that's one of the ways that, again, you have. That's one of the things that you can see with having someone like Carlos, and even Eddie Lampkin. We saw this at times as a Gordon Hayward style big man point guard with point guard skills. That they can be ball facilitators pretty much anywhere on a court, and that's something that Syracuse has desperately needed. Someone, to use a hockey reference for the hockey fans, someone who's Mitch Marner, a pass first player.
We could all use a Mitch Marner.
Did you see that? Did you see that screenshot of Marner against Boston this past weekend?
Yeah.
Yeah. For those who aren't hockey fans, it's Marner with a wide open net, and he's not even looking at the net. He is looking to the blue line and looking to pass it off, which is just it was really, really funny to see.
I mean, technically he's doing his job, but it's still hilarious.
Technically he's doing his job, but he's also a forward. And if he wants to get paid, he better shoot sometimes.
Meanwhile, I have the reverse problem. I am an Erik Karlsson.
Well, yeah.
Who is, the defenseman who forgets he needs to play defense.
Well, yes, this is indeed true.
we can just admit that your team is in a better position than mine, and
People
wrap
forgot.
this up.
I think people. I think hockey teams forgot Nico Hischier exists with all the attention that Jack Hughes gets for the New Jersey Devils.
Mhm.
Like, people forget that Nico Hischier was also a number 1 pick on this team.
Well, if I recall correctly, that was also a weird draft overall.
Yeah. Both the drafts that Hischier and Hughes were taken in were weird drafts. So,
Yeah.
At least for Syracuse, I'm not sure when the crunch season starts.
Oh, it started, dude. We had a discussion of the crunch being up here.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
right.
right.
Duh. I'm stupid.
It's about a month underway. I don't know what the record is or anything, but
Crunch are 4-3 right now, and just split a weekend series with Wilkes-Barre Scranton, 2-0 on Friday, and then 3-2 loss at Wilkes-Barre on Saturday.
and Tristan Jarry almost recreated the Tristan Jarry meme.
Did Tristan Jarry get sent down to the AHL?
He's on a conditioning loan.
That's incredible. I love that so much.
Yeah. So, unironically, he played like by AHL standards, he played good. But I swear he almost did the thing again where he passed it right to a crunch player who then whiffed on it, thank God.
Don't say that we don't cover all Syracuse sports now. We are indeed covering all the Syracuse sports, even the non-Syracuse athletic sports.
Yeah. 5 months until Syracuse Mets opening day.
We'll see if some of their top prospects are on that team, i.e. Luis Angel Acuna, if he stays there, and if Drew Gilbert actually healthy as well. But of course, Syracuse fans are focused on Virginia Tech, which is coming up this weekend, 12 p.m. on the CW. Syracuse looking to return and come back to form after the loss to Pitt. That will do it for this week's edition of the Disloyal Idiots Podcast. Mike, thank you so much for joining me. We hope to have Steven and Andy back next week for another edition of the Disloyal Idiots Podcast. Usually we stream on Sundays at 8 p.m., streaming at a different time this week, of course, due to some prior conflicts. But again, Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time is usually when we stream these on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. Search up Disloyal Idiots on Twitch or YouTube, or the Fans First Sports Network on YouTube and Twitter to find the stream. If you're listening on your podcast platform of choice, thank you so much for listening. Please leave a like, rating, review, subscription, or comment, and so that we can trick the algorithm into expanding the Ottoman Empire. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, this is a crucial time actually for Syracuse football. It starts off with a game against Virginia Tech. And so all you can do at this time is say, go Orange.
Go Orange indeed.